If you were to walk into a bustling medieval tavern right now, the person brewing the ale in the back, managing the incredibly complex accounting books, and throwing out the drunks at the end of the night almost certainly wasn't a man.
Right. It was almost always a woman.
Which completely shatters the mental movie set we usually build for this era, doesn't it? I mean, when you picture the Middle Ages, that massive thousand-year stretch from the 5th to the 15th century, I can almost guarantee your brain conjures up a world of mud.
Mud, stone castles, and, knights in clanking armor.
Exactly. Kings pointing swords at maps. It feels like an intensely masculine, heavy, metal and stone kind of world.
It is the classic Hollywood medieval aesthetic. Very grim, very loud, and entirely dominated by the men swinging the swords.
But what if half of that movie set is completely missing? What if the true, unseen power of the era, the actual economic and administrative engine keeping those castles running, the local markets afloat, and the intellectual world alive, what if all of that was wielded by women?
That is exactly what the historical record shows if you actually know where to look.
Right, so today we are going on a deep dive to look at these silent architects of history.
And to do that, we are synthesizing some truly landmark academic texts. We're pulling from the detailed historical analyses of Georges Duby, Judith M. Bennett, Eileen Power, and Barbara Tuchman.
Which are incredible sources.
They really are. And we are backing that up by looking directly at the primary archives from the British Library and Fordham University's medieval sourcebook.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because reading through these sources, it is just a constant series of counterintuitive revelations. We are not just walking through a dry timeline today.
No, definitely not.
We want to look at the actual mechanisms of how this society functioned behind the curtain. But before we get into the specifics of noble women or peasant markets, how should we frame our baseline understanding here? Because if you look at the legal codes of the Middle Ages, women didn't exactly have it easy.
Yeah, that tension between the law and reality is the crucial starting point for this entire deep dive. If you only read the official legal codes of the time, you will see a society where women were significantly restricted.
Like legally subordinated to their fathers and then to their husbands.
Exactly. But limited legal rights on paper did not translate to a lack of practical day-to-day power. Official law and lived reality were two very different things.
Because power in the Middle Ages was highly decentralized, right?
Yes. There was no massive federal bureaucracy or, omnipresent police force. Power existed on a local level, meaning if you were physically present and capable of managing resources, you held the power.
And that reality brings us right to the top of the social ladder, the noble castles. The grand illusion we have is that the lord of the manor is sitting on his throne, just micromanaging his lands.
Which rarely happened.
Right. Because power was decentralized, those lords were constantly leaving. They were getting called away to fight in localized wars or to attend the king's distant court or, to go on multi-year crusades. The massive gap left behind is where the women stepped in.
Taking that a step further, a medieval estate was not just a large house you needed to keep tidy. It was a sprawling, incredibly complex economic and military machine.
It was a whole ecosystem.
It really was. It had its own agricultural production cycles, its own judicial courts to settle local disputes, its own physical defenses, and its own taxation system.
Yeah.
And when the lord was away, which, as the archives show, was a frequent and prolonged occurrence, the lady of the castle became the ultimate decision-maker. She possessed tremendous administrative authority.
Reading Barbara Tuchman's accounts of this, the best analogy I could think of is that these noble women were essentially the chief operating officers of massive modern-day corporations.
That's a really good way to put it.
Think about it. The husband is the CEO, but he's off on a permanent, incredibly violent PR tour, shaking hands, forming alliances, and swinging swords.
Right.
Meanwhile, the COO is back at headquarters, managing the supply chain, balancing the budget, handling human resources by settling disputes among the peasantry, and occasionally even organizing the physical defense of the corporate headquarters if a rival company tries a hostile takeover.
That corporate analogy highlights the sheer scale of the responsibility. The survival of the noble house and its continued generational wealth depended entirely on the financial and administrative competence of the women running it.
Because they are auditing ledgers, right?
Oh, absolutely. Auditing ledgers, overseeing the planting and harvesting of thousands of acres, and making localized legal rulings that carried the weight of law.
Which naturally brings us to Eleanor of Aquitaine. I was looking at the Fordham University sourcebook, and her resume in the 12th century is just staggering.
It really is unmatched.
She wasn't just managing a single estate. She was a geopolitical titan. She was Queen of France, then Queen of England. She had massive sway over the governance of both kingdoms, and she even strapped on armor and participated in the Second Crusade.
Yeah, she was a powerhouse.
But I have to push back a little here. When you see someone that famous, you have to wonder, was Eleanor an absolute exception? Was she a historical unicorn, or is she just the most visible example of a much broader trend of female leadership?
What's fascinating here is that while Eleanor's scale of influence was exceptional, the fundamental nature of her influence was entirely standard for her class.
Really?
Standard.
Yes. She represents the absolute peak of a very real systemic reliance on female management. She wasn't breaking the rules of her society. She was maximizing the existing expectations placed on noble women.
Oh, wow. So they already expected this kind of capability from her. Exactly. The fact that she could command such authority managing military, logistics, and supply lines during a crusade, negotiating international treaties that was possible because the cultural muscle memory for female leadership was already deeply baked into the aristocratic system.
So lords just expected their wives to be highly capable administrators.
They had to. Eleanor just took that baseline expectation of running a localized estate and applied it to the geopolitics of Western Europe.
It is an incredible shift in perspective. But, power isn't just about crowns and massive stone castles. True power is capital. True power is economic production.
Absolutely.
So let's follow the causal chain down the social ladder. Those massive noble estates couldn't function without the everyday women who actually drove the medieval economic engine. Because the sources make it clear that the grand nobility only made up a tiny fraction of the population.
Right. The vast majority were peasants.
And the rural peasant women were literally the backbone of the entire system.
Judith M. Bennett's research breaks down the mechanics of this beautifully. Peasant life was an all-hands-on-deck survival economy.
Everyone had to work.
Everyone. Women in the countryside were engaged in heavy agricultural labor right alongside the men, plowing fields, harvesting crops. But their specific domain was where the actual surplus was generated.
And surplus means money.
Exactly. They managed the livestock, handled the incredibly labor-intensive dairy production, which was a crucial protein source that could be preserved, and perhaps most importantly, they brewed the ale.
And brewing ale in the Middle Ages wasn't some casual hobby. It was a fundamental survival mechanism.
Because the water wasn't always safe.
Exactly. Water wasn't safe to drink, so ale was consumed by everyone, including children. It was a heavily caloric, sanitized part of the daily diet. And women essentially held a complete monopoly on local brewing.
They owned the specialized equipment, and they possessed the generational knowledge of the fermentation process. But this wasn't just for their own family.
Right, they were selling it.
Exactly. The surplus dairy, the textiles they wove at home, and the massive vats of ale were taken to the local markets. These women were incredibly active traders.
So they were basically running the local economy.
They were. They were negotiating bulk prices, managing inventory, and driving the local cash economy.
That distinction between subsistence and cash is so critical. Because you could grow your own turnips to eat, but paying taxes to that noble estate we just talked about, or paying tithes to the church, required actual coinage.
You couldn't pay your taxes in turnips.
Exactly. The market activities of these rural women haggling over cheese and ale were often the single factor keeping a peasant family solvent and off the streets.
And that rural surplus of goods created a massive need for organized urban markets. Which brings us to the cities.
Right, and this is where things get significantly more complicated. When we look at medieval cities, they were entirely defined by the guild system.
Very strict monopolies.
Yes. If you wanted to be a blacksmith, a baker, a shoemaker, or a merchant, you had to be a sanctioned member of the guild. And these guilds were notoriously rigid. They were fiercely protective of their monopolies, and generally speaking, they deliberately marginalized women because they didn't want the competition.
They wanted to keep it a boys' club.
But reading through the British Library archives, there is this fascinating mechanism that changes everything. Here's where it gets really interesting. The sources talk about the widow loophole.
The widow loophole is a perfect demonstration of how harsh economic pragmatism will almost always override patriarchal rules.
How so?
Well, in most guilds, a master craftsman could only be a man. But the reality of medieval life was that mortality rates were high. If a master craftsman died, his widow was suddenly thrust into a very precarious position.
And under strict patriarchal rules, the guild should shut her down.
That's the assumption, yeah.
But wait, if these guilds were so intensely protective of their male monopolies, why on earth would they let a widow take over? Wouldn't the other blacksmiths or bakers just seize the opportunity to absorb her husband's business and eliminate a competitor?
That is exactly what you'd expect. But the guilds had to weigh that desire for a monopoly against the reality of municipal taxes and civic duty.
Oh, because she'd become a burden on the city.
Exactly. If the guild shut that widow's business down, she and her children would instantly become destitute. They would become a massive drain on the city's very limited charity resources.
That makes total sense.
Right. So to prevent this economic burden, municipal authorities and many guilds pragmatically allowed widows to inherit their late husband's guild status and assume full control of the business.
Think about the sheer resilience you would need to pull that off. You were grieving your husband, and suddenly overnight you have to step entirely into his shoes.
With no formal warning.
None. You have to navigate a rigid, hostile, male-dominated professional monopoly just to keep a roof over your children's heads. And the archives show they didn't just survive, they thrived.
They really did.
You read primary accounts of widows running massive, complex blacksmithing forges. They were managing multiple male apprentices, negotiating bulk material contracts for iron, and turning significant profits.
The historical records are full of their ledgers. And it is important to note that it wasn't just widows taking over traditionally male-coded professions. There were entire sprawling industries where women were the recognized, undisputed specialists from day one.
Regardless of their marital status.
Exactly. Textile production is the prime example. The spinning of yarn, the complex weaving of specific cloths, the intricate embroidery, this massive economic sector, was completely female-dominated.
Eileen Power's work talks about this a lot.
Yes, she extensively highlights the silk women of London. These were highly skilled, fiercely independent artisans. They operated their own lucrative businesses, they exclusively took on their own female apprentices, and they aggressively defended their trade rights in local courts.
It totally flips the traditional narrative. I mean,
Yeah.
we picture a medieval woman as completely subservient, maybe locked in a tower, or entirely dependent on a male relative.
A damsel in distress.
Right. But the economic reality is that the local tavern, the bustling textile shop, and the most profitable market stall were often owned, operated, and aggressively defended by women.
The entire urban economy simply would have collapsed without their entrepreneurship, their capital, and their physical labor.
Okay, so if women were the secret engine of the rural and urban economies, what about the intellectual world? Because the physical labor of survival in the Middle Ages sounds exhausting.
It was incredibly grueling.
And when we think of medieval education, we immediately think of the early universities, Oxford, Bologna, Paris, and those were strictly, legally boys' clubs. Education was notoriously restricted. But the sources reveal a hidden sanctuary for female genius, the monasteries.
The religious life is perhaps the most heavily misunderstood aspect of medieval women's history. From a modern perspective, we tend to view a woman becoming a nun as a restriction, a literal shutting away from the world behind stone walls.
It seems like a prison from the outside.
Right, but for a medieval woman, entering a convent or a monastery was very often a path to profound intellectual and physical liberation.
It is completely counterintuitive until you look at the mechanism of daily life. The monastery was a physical escape from two massive threats. First, it freed women from the extreme, often fatal dangers of medieval childbirth.
Which was a very real, constant fear.
And second, it freed them from the endless, grueling domestic labor we just discussed. The churning, the cloughing, the brewing. I kept thinking of the monastery as the medieval equivalent of a highly exclusive tech incubator or a fully funded research fellowship.
That analogy works perfectly. If you look at what an incubator actually provides, it provides capital, a protected space to experiment, and the physical tools to innovate.
Which is exactly what the monasteries offered.
It really is. That is exactly what a monastery did for a woman with a brilliant mind in the 12th century. It was the only place in society where she had access to extensive libraries, the costly physical materials like ink and parchment, and the sheer quiet time required to actually think and write.
And what they produced in that time is astounding. Nuns were among the most highly educated people in society. They weren't just quietly praying in the dark. They were meticulously copying ancient texts.
And we shouldn't gloss over that.
Right. Manuscript production was a highly rigorous technical skill. Grinding the pigments, preparing the vellum, the intense intellectual discipline of translation. They essentially held a monopoly on the preservation of knowledge.
And beyond copying, they were writing original, groundbreaking, philosophical, and scientific works.
And no single historical figure embodies the power of this intellectual sanctuary better than Hildegard of Bingen.
She is an absolute legend.
Hildegard is a force of nature.
Just looking at the what of her life makes me feel incredibly lazy. I mean, she lived in the 12th century, and her resume includes being a world-class composer whose music is still performed and recorded today, by the way.
Which is mind-blowing.
She was a deeply respected theologian, a playwright, and a pioneering natural scientist. She produced extensive, meticulously detailed works on medicine and botany. She was diagnosing complex illnesses and cataloging the specific healing properties of plants at a time when a large portion of the population firmly believed sickness was just a random punishment from God. But the how-W of Hildegard's life, how she managed to exert so much influence in a deeply patriarchal society, is the true masterclass in medieval power dynamics.
How did she do it?
Well, if we connect her specific story to the bigger picture, Hildegard reveals how intellectual brilliance translated into tangible social and political authority. Because she operated strictly within the framework of the church, she utilized a brilliant theological loophole. She claimed that her profound insights came directly from divine visions.
Ah, so that is the mechanism. By claiming she was merely a vessel for God's voice, the powerful men around her couldn't silence her without essentially trying to silence God.
Precisely the dynamic at play. She achieved a deeply protected status. She wasn't just a scholar. She was a recognized, institutionalized mystic. And because of that theological armor, she commanded deep respect from the most powerful men in Europe.
Even kings and popes.
Oh, absolutely. Emperors, popes, and kings regularly wrote to her, seeking her strategic and spiritual advice. She even went on public preaching tours across Europe, openly and aggressively chastising corrupt male clergy. The level of authority she exerted over the men who theoretically ruled her was monumental.
It really makes you wonder how much human progress was delayed because we didn't have a million more Hildegards with access to a library and a safe space to think.
It's a sobering thought.
It is.
Yeah.
But this level of localized influence we've been tracking, whether it's the widows running the massive urban guilds, the noble women managing the vast agricultural estates, or the brilliant abbesses advising popes, it builds up over centuries. And a core historical truth is that whenever a marginalized group gains substantial economic and intellectual power, it disrupts the status quo.
And the status quo always strikes back.
It does. And this brings us to a massive structural shift. In the late Middle Ages, moving into the late 15th century, we see a horrific, systemic societal backlash that profoundly alters the trajectory of women's history.
This is the darkest, but perhaps the most illuminating part of our deep dive. For centuries, women have been quietly building this localized, decentralized power, but then society starts to shift. We enter the dawn of the Renaissance.
Things start becoming more centralized.
Exactly. Nation-states start to form and centralize their governments. Early capitalism begins to take root with larger trade networks. Universities formalize education, and suddenly these newly centralized, male-dominated institutions decide they want all that localized power back.
And this centralization culminates in the horror of the witch hunts.
It is a massive historical paradox. We are taught to view the Renaissance as an explosion of light, logic, and progress. And for men, it largely was. But for women, the Renaissance was the systemic closing of doors.
Right.
The witch hunts are frequently and incorrectly categorized as a phenomenon of the superstitious Dark Ages. But they actually gained terrifying systematic momentum at the dawn of the Renaissance, specifically fueled by texts published in the late 15th century.
And the most infamous of these is the Malleus Maleficarum.
Yes, or The Hammer of Witches, published in 1486.
I was looking at the excerpts from the Malleus Maleficarum in the Fordham sourcebook, and I was shocked by how specific and legally clinical it was. It doesn't just casually say witches exist. It explicitly defines women as being physically, intellectually, and spiritually more prone to witchcraft.
It's deeply misogynistic.
It claims women are inherently weaker in faith and more susceptible to the devil. How did a single book manage to legally justify the execution of thousands?
The mechanism was the newly invented printing press. The Malleus Maleficarum became an international bestseller, spreading across Europe with unprecedented speed. And it didn't just spread fear, it provided the intellectual, theological, and most importantly, the legal framework to accuse, torture, and execute.
It essentially weaponized the law.
It effectively codified deep-seated misogyny into statutory law. Before this book, local magic or folk healing, which was almost exclusively practiced by women who held generational knowledge of botany and midwifery, was generally tolerated. It was just a normal part of everyday medieval life.
But the book changed that.
Entirely. The Malleus Maleficarum explicitly criminalized that specific female-held knowledge. It reframed the female local healer, the independent wealthy widow, or the outspoken woman as a literal legal agent of Satan.
So what does this all mean? I have to ask the pointed question here. Were the witch hunts really about a sudden, terrifying religious fear of magic? Or were they a targeted, systematic economic weapon used to strip women of the independence and social influence they had painstakingly built up over the previous centuries?
Ah, that's the real question.
Because when you look at the archives of who was actually accused, it wasn't random. It was very often the widow who owned prime property, the independent healer who competed with male doctors, or the woman who simply didn't fit neatly under male authority.
This raises an incredibly important question about historical causality, and many modern historians lean heavily toward your second point.
The economic weapon theory.
Exactly. While the religious terror was undoubtedly very real and visceral to the everyday people experiencing it, the function of the witch hunts was deeply economic and political. By legally criminalizing female autonomy under the guise of heresy, the emerging centralized states and the newly professionalized male guilds could effectively push women entirely out of the public sphere.
Wow. So it was a massive power grab.
It was. Male doctors with formal, expensive university degrees used these laws to replace the local female healers. Male-run, proto-capitalist enterprises pushed out the independent tradeswomen. The witch hunts were, in many ways, the violent enforcement of a newly rigid patriarchal order.
The goal was to entirely erase the fluid, decentralized power women had wielded so effectively during the High Middle Ages.
Precisely.
It is a devastating transition to read about, and it perfectly explains why our mental movie set of the Middle Ages is so skewed today. The history books were written by the victors of that late medieval backlash. As the universities and centralized states took over the narrative, they deliberately wrote the women out of the official record.
They systematically recorded the lineage of kings, the shifting of borders, and the outcomes of endless battles, but they left the complex accounting ledgers of the noblewomen, the bustling market stalls of the peasant women, and the monumental intellectual achievements of the nuns completely out of the mainstream historical curriculum for centuries.
But the truth always survives in the raw archives. From managing sprawling, complex estates while the king was away, to driving the rural cash economy with ale and dairy, to dominating the urban textile trades, advancing botany in the cloistered gardens, and surviving a horrific, systematic societal backlash, women were the silent, load-bearing architects of the medieval world.
They really were the foundation of society.
To you listening right now, the modern world you navigate every day, the core economic foundations of Europe, the preservation of classical knowledge that sparked the Renaissance it is, built entirely on the foundation of this unseen labor. The Middle Ages weren't just shaped by men swinging swords, they were sustained, funded, and managed by women with ledger books, looms, and quills.
It forces a complete reevaluation of what we consider to be historical importance. True power isn't always loud or violent. Sometimes true power is the steady, daily, highly competent act of keeping society from collapsing in on itself.
Which brings us right back to that movie set we talked about at the beginning. If the official medieval records could so easily and deliberately ignore the thousands of women running the entire economy, reducing a towering genius like Hildegard of Bingen to a mere footnote for centuries, it begs a massive, almost uncomfortable question for us today.
What's that?
What massive societal shifts or entirely invisible labor forces are building our modern world right now? Who is completely missing from today's official data that historians in the year 2500 will have to dig up and do a deep dive on, just to realize they were the ones actually running the show? Something for you to mull over as you go about your day. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.